Okay, so I recently made a recordings that I uploaded with the title of like loose moral rambling or something like that. And it's I mean even in the beginning of the introduction I say that this is going to be an embarrassing recording, and it certainly is, because I'm just kind of doing almost a brute force confrontation of many different strains and trying to aggregate them into some kind of thematic understanding. And I kind of do that, but it's very hard to follow. It's very tenuous. Um, I can imagine that an audience would get very different things out of it. But I mean, a lot of it sounds disparate, and a lot of the things that I'm drawing together might not be seen as naturally. I don't explicitly talk about, but anyway, I was making that recording in some sense for myself, and because it sort of allows me to sort of explore. I mean, it's a kind of bad to upload those kinds of recordings, because it's sort of, I mean, it shows my thinking, which I think is might be a valuable. It shows my thought process to some degree, but in the this will be a refinement of those strains, those threads of subject matter into a much more comprehensive synthesis, because I often intuitively construct like a kind of a conceptual way of thinking about it, about a particular issue, but I don't explain it that well, because I haven't I only understand it in a kind of in a very principled way, and not in a kind of experiential, idea of how what this means correlated with all other aspects of living, and framing it in a very comprehensive way where it can be seen with any kind of clarity or exactitude in terms of its how it would be particularly performed. You know, anyway, I've since that recording, I've had a lot of discussions with a lot of other people who have asked me questions and things like that, and it which has been very helpful to me, because it shows, it forces me to kind of ground a lot of my philosophy, and see how how I'm kind of missing potentially the audience by assuming that there's a lot of already shared moral sentiments. And so I'm going to kind of build my view of morality up, or let's say my phenomenological kind of self-actualization. I'm going to frame it from a kinds of from how it would be developed, from how it would be grown, um, in a kind of and this is interesting, because this might also have a parallel to education and pedagogy. Um, this will be a kind of useful recording in that, but then I also want to clean up and refine a lot of the things, a lot of the threads that I mentioned in that recording. So one of these things that I've been throwing around, is moral anarchism, and that can mean a lot of things. It's without the proper context, and I've also said, oh, I like technocracy, or I'm arguing for a version of technocracy. And these things are almost very dangerous things to say without fully contextualizing them, because and this is all my fault for just saying these things. Um, and I do round out these concepts. I do round out this thinking in my discourse when I talked about these things. But you now at least I've got the explicit caveats, or the specific context needed to kind of refine those things that I've said, which I think by themselves, without context, can be quite dangerous or pernicious. So when I say that I'm a kind of technocrat, um, that is a useful way of phrasing the very sophisticated point that I'm trying to make, which is the necessities of a stable governmental framework and political structure that actually can conserve its own integrity, and preserve its own values. So what I mean by a kind of technocracy is that politics will still have a soft cultural war attached to it, but there won't be any hard facets in some sense, because the constitutional structure and legal framework will force a kind of moral transparency. So it will be a technocracy within limits. That, usually the pernicious aspects of a technocracy is that you just kind of have experts that can do whatever they want. With their highfalutin, sophisticated expertise. And that's fundamentally problematic because, as soon as you shield something with a kind of, with a specialist, when you shield a decision or a policy with some kind of specialization, there's a moral opaqueness there. And it also destroys the human understanding, and therefore, because it can potentially override the individual understanding, there's a kind of, there's a moral lacuna waiting to happen, essentially. And so, and this must also be, there's this wonderful quote from one of the Dune books. I've been watching this wonderful YouTube channel called Quinn's Ideas, where he talks about, he takes excerpts and he talks about the content and the plot of Dune, which I do think that the whole plot of that book has, obviously, it's very informed by anthropology and religion and philosophy and concepts. But yeah, I mean, I can obviously, I can see a lot of parallels between that and even very deep doctrinal religious teachings and things like that. Obviously, people can think that I'm projecting things, but anyway, I mean, I think that there's a lot of richness that, just in the story of Dune, and if you can kind of take that as a spiritual metaphor, you can really, it can really update you very quickly in terms of, just in terms of the lore of Dune and the kind. Anyway, but maybe I'll give some commentary about that later on. But the exact quote that I'm talking about is just a little snippet. I think it was in Quinn's part 4 of sort of like, I think, the Ultimate Guide to Dune part 4. I think it was in there when he talks about what the difference between a good administrator and a bad administrator, and he says basically. A good administrator is someone who is capable of making mistakes and then correcting those mistakes, because then they can actually respond to things in a timeous way, and they can actually sort of think on their feet, as it were. And if an administrator is allowed to think on their feet and is allowed to make mistakes and then concede those mistakes and correct them, you get like a much higher form of governance or administration, in some sense. And obviously, when you have experts doing things in a technocracy, they have the perverse incentive to double down and entrench themselves into a bad decision in order to safeguard the technocratic implement, in some sense. And that kind of thing cannot. One of the ways to avert that completely is avoid that completely, is that you expect decisions to live up to principles and values and a kind of moral framework which everyone can understand, and decisions must be translated into how they are substantiated through that generic moral framework or something like that. And that enforces a kind of moral transparency. So you can't have certain, I brought this up in the example of that, well, you couldn't have a single payer, you probably couldn't have a kind of, if you wanted to fight over government, and some people wanted a more sort of social democracy, or socialistic democracy, that had like a single payer for its health services. Well, if you tried to generate a single payer structure, you wouldn't then be able to say, well, we're not going to pay, if your policy around that single payer said that, well, we will pay for some things and we won't pay for other things. Well, no, if you've got that kind of structure, you better say why some people are excluded from getting the government rebate or giving um, or sorry, slightly contradicting myself on a kind of, yeah. So I mean, single payer, does that mean that the service, anyway, I mean, yeah, so what does actual single payer mean? Does that mean that the, because I mean, even systems that have single payer, that are called single payer, I guess I don't actually understand exactly what the term means, because I know that even structures that have, even societies that have that, um, sometimes the patient does pay a little bit, or you know, I know that in Britain they they massively changed that to fix that structure, that you know, that if you needed transportation to get to the hospital, that you would actually be paid that transportation fee, um, or if you but that there is also a private medical system in Britain, for instance. It's just um, and obviously the single payer has nothing to do with that. But essentially, I mean, as far as I know, the single payer means that there is no co-pay. It's all paid for by the government, essentially. That there's no other cost or fee attached to the service. Anyway, if you wanted to create a structure like that, or even subsidy for medical services, you wouldn't be able to say, well, you know, you could put in certain restrictions, maybe, that, well, if this therapy is going to save your life or something like that, then we will pay for it. But if the therapy is not some kind of like thing that saves your life, then we're not going to pay for it, which also I think creates a kind of perverse incentive anyway, because that puts an incentive against people maintaining wellness and health, um, and it gives them assistance when they're on death's door, when essentially, you know, healthcare should be probably more balanced in trying to focus on preventative intervention, or you know, anyway. But anyway, the whole point that I'm trying to make is that the government would not be able to set up arbitrary barriers as to what things would be paid for and what things wouldn't be paid for. That essentially, if they're going to create some kind of single pay or some kind of subsidy, they're going to have to structure it in such a way that it's not identified that these specialists get subsidies or are provided for by the single payer and other specialists don't. There would have to be some kind of understandable classification or designation there in the rules, a designation that would be something that someone could litigate over, because it wouldn't just be, you know, it would have to have reasons in it that were kind of morally, so that consistency, that moral consistency could be essentially, you know, I mean, this is really part of the basic requirement of the rule of law as well, that objective criteria must apply evenly, essentially, across the board. And so they could still have, you know, sort of a kind of bias, or, you know, because the government, you know, has won a mandate to implement their policy, and so within the kind of the soft choices that can be made, but the hard limit would be that essentially the law must, you know, sort of be, you know, like a general law of application. Uh, anyway, yeah, I could probably be saying this in a much more eloquent way. But anyway, let me move on. So when I say that I want there to be a kind of technocracy, I'm basically saying that the government is forced into translating its sentiments into a kind of technocratic format that is capable of being invigilated against individual rights, essentially. And so, yeah, I haven't thought about this well enough, I guess, to talk about this fluidly, but essentially, you wouldn't be able to create a law that said the people on this list are medical practitioners and service providers, and if you go to these people on this list, you get the single payer health policy providing for the service provided by those people. You wouldn't be able to create lists like that. You would have to frame it in general terms. Okay, so there's that. The other sort of buzzword is and which is actually very much linked to this, is the kind of moral anarchism, which is essentially, look, I mean, even a state that does this, I think, will still imprint on people a kind of, because I do think that the legal ethos of any society becomes a kind of moral foundational, almost constitution that people imbibe culturally. I do think that, people say that politics is downstream of culture. Well, I say culture is downstream of the legal framework and the legal structure. And when we have structures that don't respect the individual, that don't safeguard the dignity and the sovereignty of the moral conscientiousness of the individual, when they subordinate that individual to some kind of groupthink or moral authority, which the group has because it's some kind of fascistic bundle of will that is tied together in some majoritarian fiat, that is a dehumanizing, that degrades the understanding. So we need to have a Bill of Rights that has a limitations clause so that everyone knows how rights are limited, and if they're going to be limited for individuals, or the state is going to infringe rights, it's going to be the same process of adjudicating or rectifying the consequences of infringement and the implementation of constitutional remedy. Anyway, so the issue is moral anarchism is just a way to say that there is a soft cultural morality which will not be given a kind of joy in terms of the state. It will not be given a platform to, like, it can influence, like, for example, if you wanted to inculcate a culture of life, you wouldn't be able to stop people. I mean, this is really the biggest borderline case. This is really the starkest case to make this point, that if you want a culture of life and you believe that abortion is murder, you wouldn't be able to outlaw it. You could try to do things that would discourage it. You could push for public education. You could push for certain forms of moral instruction, even, or you could create subsidies for educational facilities to have moral instructors or something like that, and then you could have organizations that go around preaching morality. but that is going to be part of the soft cultural power that has to be fought over in culture itself, in society itself. It cannot be imposed by government, it cannot be mandated through the state. It can be encouraged by the state, but it cannot be enforced by the state. So if you want a culture of life, you're going to actually have to be a part of cultivating it in the soft cultural arena, not in the hard arena of state power. That is so it's kind of like, so that's what I mean by moral anarchism. I mean that, and that is also a very, that's slightly a sophisticated, it's not a clear way of expressing what I mean when I call it moral anarchism, but essentially the basic understanding that the state is not a representation of the moral law. The state can enforce certain aspects of the moral law and can make it possible. That a state that I'm describing, I believe, is a necessary condition to having a decent society, but it is not a sufficient condition to having a decent society. And this is important because if we don't empower individual, conscientious, moral matters, moral concern in terms of what actually mattered to people in terms of their own moral thinking, if we convert that into a political fight over who controls the ring of power, it's a corrupting it. I mean it anyway. So that is, that I think is the most condensed way that I can describe the necessity of what I call moral anarchism. Is that when we believe that we live in a state of moral anarchism, then suddenly morality matters only to the extent that you think it matters, and then nihilism will become a cultural currency or a commodity that will actually matter, because and on the psychological level, let's just say, and on the individual level, we will actually be able to see those nihilists and those who aren't nihilistic. It will actually be part of our sensibility. The idea that just because the state won't enforce morality, that people will forget about morality, is a I think a crazy idea. But also there will be, morality won't be politically, it won't be removed from politics, but it will have to be, there'll have to be a translation function, that you can't essentially, as I said, that if you want to vote for a party that encourages the culture of life, they can only encourage it, they can't enforce it, as it were. Which means that there's going to be a much more technocratic deployment of how things are enforced, how things are implemented, how policy is created and devised, and then actually we can say, well, actually this was a bad policy. Let's actually look at what were the results of this policy. Did it do good things or did it do bad things? And there will be a different kind of technocratic calculus, because a lot of things are counterintuitive. When you are actually doing something about a symptom, you can look like that you're doing a lot of good, but you're actually creating perverse incentives potentially, or you are helping to perpetuate the problem, and you're actually wasting resources when you could actually have a different strategy. This is also why I say that legalizing drugs, not just decriminalizing them, but actually legalizing them to bring down the cost of drugs, like narcotics, illicit substances. I would like there to be cocaine fields in in what's it called? In greenhouses, to bring down the cost of cocaine down to nothing. And you can only purchase the stuff, if you're over 21, and maybe there'll be some restrictions for some people that have gotten certain court orders away from them. But the point of this is just because if there is not any money in the industry, if the industry, if essentially, I even want it to be a kind of public. I mean, I want it to be a controlled substance. I mean, I certainly don't want it to be uncontrolled. And it should certainly be a crime for it to be peddled to minors. But the idea is that there should be enough supply on hand for illicit drugs that the price is very low. It's so low that you can get it at a supermarket, or you can go and get it the price is so low that no one has an incentive to sell it on a street corner. And I mean, this is quite a sort of heartless thing to say, and there will be a human cost to this, and it will be terrible. But in the long term, the human cost will be so worth it, because this is how you actually destroy drugs in society. You remove the incentive for people to sell it to people. So you won't have pushers anymore, and there'll be so little money in it, essentially, that there'll be no incentive, and you'll restrict marketing. So you'll make it available, but you will restrict marketing, and essentially you will create a legal supply chain that will undercut the cost of the illicit market, and you won't have people with guns anymore on the streets. You won't have violence. You won't have fighting over territory. So you will absolutely remove the money from gang violence. In fact, I don't think that there can be gangs if you don't have drugs. If you don't have the war on drugs, you won't have that kind of organized criminality. Will essentially be completely. Then the only criminality we'll have left is essentially the kind of kleptocratic government elite, government politically connected corruption. I almost think that maybe the war on drugs is a nice diversion for the politicians to so that people can be vulnerable enough in their own, not being kept safe and secure by this never-ending war on drugs, that we can't have enough attention left over to actually, keep an eye on politics and keep politicians honest and responsive to doing a good job. Anyway, so these are my kinds of you could call them counterintuitive strategies, and but anyway, but it certainly, I look, the Constitution would not enforce what I just recommended. You wouldn't be able to. Actually, it's arguable if some freedoms would equate into the freedom of bodily autonomy, but I mean that would essentially, at the very least, perhaps drugs that it could be proven can be used, or that is often yeah. What I was going to say is that certain substances that are very, very dangerous, I don't think you would be able to enforce the Constitution would not force that to be legalized, because essentially the balancing of the cost benefit essentially would not, but let's say drugs that were not so dangerous, I think, and that had some benefits to them. So drugs that could be used safely, I think that you would be able to probably develop some kind of constitutional, and maybe that kind of constitutional intervention would not legalize the drug. It would mean that you could essentially get some kind of special dispensation, like the court could declare that you have, that you, by application or something like that, that you're asking for, that these laws don't apply to you, criminalizing the drug in relation to you, or something like that. Anyway, I mean, I mean, that sounds a bit unwieldy, but I mean, if a court did that, then it would also probably say Parliament should develop some legislation that regularizes this, that people can apply for some kind of license um, to use some drugs or something like that after so that it's still a controlled substance. So I mean, anyway, so this is a bit of a kind of finicky thing, but I mean, there are such things as systemic effects, and so I think that there can be arguments that are made that certain professions, even like prostitution being the most famous one, um, oh man, these are all the hard cases that I'm just sort of, that are just rising to the top of my head now. And just realizing that well, me talking about, well, I've got the solution to essentially the framework of government means that essentially I have to be able to, but maybe I should think about these topics more broadly. But I mean, I do think that my structure and my formula that I have laid out does in principle lead you to settling all these hard problems and showing you the wiggle room in which you can still have a soft cultural power that influences politics, and politics interfaces with creating law and creating policy, that is fine. Um, and in some sense, it's not a question of should prostitution be illegal or legal. It's more about, it's not like an on or off switch. It's more about, well, if you are going to legalize it, how would it be legalized? And if you um, and how restrictive could you be? And in some sense, the default should generally be that everything is free to do. That should be the default of the liberal society, is that you're free to do anything that doesn't harm somebody else. And um, without getting into the paradox of the kind of the strange paternalism, where we're saving you from yourself. Although some people do need to be saved from themselves, but that, I mean, this is why in the South African legal tradition, you're capable of getting someone deemed um, a prodigal, named after sort of the prodigal son. Um, a court's declaration of prodigality is was always something that was a very, very touchy thing for a court to do, and it really was loath to do it, even if they thought that the person was a, a prodigal, that they wouldn't do it. That it really, that the actual, you can actually see the jurisprudence around declarations of prodigality are, it's that the person, because people need, in some, because there's a basic respect in the South African legal tradition that people have a right essentially to destroy themselves. If someone is willful in that way, it's not, in some sense the person has to be begging to be declared a prodigal, so that if they're declared a prodigal, then their guardian or their trustee uh, can tell the casino, don't let this person in, don't treat them like a major. They are, in regards to you, they have a declaration of prodigality, so it's attached to their identity number. So when they go to the casino, then if the casino treats them to being able to do those things, they don't count, or at least if the people have made every opportunity, have made every attempt to inform all the casinos that this person is a prodigal, and they should keep a registry. That would be the responsible thing to do. Anyway, the casinos should keep it. So anyway, so these are the kinds of issues, and I mean, I do actually think that I think this position in South Africa around prostitution um, is probably I mean, this is where morality and politics and the law kind of all come together in very interesting things. And, different countries have done lots of different things, but technically in South Africa, prostitution is still unlawful, but they've legalized it in a strange halfway, in that it's no longer unlawful to sell sex, it's only unlawful to purchase sex. So the client is criminalized and the seller is decriminalized. So technically, prostitution is still illegal, but because it's been decriminalized, it's probably quite a good compromise in some sense, because this means that prostitutes, if they are abused by certain people that might be their client in the course of their work, they can go to the police and they can lay charges. Whereas before, that was not going to happen, because if a prostitute went to go lay charges, part of the story would be, yes, in my course of work of prostitution, and then suddenly they'd be arrested. So the decriminalization of the sale of sex certainly, I think, was quite an ingenious innovation there, in order to but essentially the default should be that it's completely legal on both ends. That that would be the default. But I think that criminalizing the purchase of sex, yeah, you see, libertarian freedom of association, freedom of contract. There's also, sort of freedom for work as well. Yeah, I mean, I think that the only thing that you could do is that you could regulate it in such a way to try to make it more morally transparent. That's all the government could hope to do if they wanted to kind of control it, but it wouldn't control prostitution in diminishing it outright at all. In fact, so actually that would also be another thing that would just sort of go out the window, I guess, is that but government could regulate it. They could create structures that said, well, if you have sex, you must have a contract, and that contract sort of must be in writing, and certain topics must be covered, certain subjects must be covered, so as to I mean, I can't think about them offhand, but sort of you know uh, hard limits and soft limits, kind of, like in the same way that people, when they are involved in, kind of casual sex in their private lives with people that are basically strangers to them or something like that, and perhaps they do other strange things, and they have safe words that obviously you need something like you need a safe word for both parties, probably, to be ultimately safe. Um, Obviously, in practice, this might not be necessary. If a client and a provider have a kind of contractual understanding that is negotiated without words, or there's a kind of cultural understanding, or there's a kind of regularity, or there's a kind of um, uh, uh, sort of unspoken consistency about what these things entail. So when there's a custom of what things entail, but sort of expecting that to be translated into some kind of contract, just so that it is kind of all on the up and up, and that all the rules are, and even that doesn't even protect people most of the time, because some people, when it comes to sex, are for reasons of their own psychological profile, or people are there are a lot of psychologically damaged people. So just because you have all these things doesn't mean that you aren't going to have things spiraling out of control, and things like that. But Anyway, the human condition is messy, kind of thing. But what is my point? So yeah, I think that regulating things like that, it is. I think that there can actually be general arguments made as to why prostitution should be illegal, because I mean, it all really has to do with you could call it economic coercion. That the valuation that sex itself is a necessary part of intimacy, and that it should not be commercialized, and that for a kind of psychological integrity. But again, like that is a kind of soft moral concern that needs to be translated into the state in a way that is rigorous. So I mean, it sounds a bit sad, but it's and what I'm about to say is going to sound incredibly classist, but it seems that, like, ideally, I think the way that you could restrict prostitution according to the framework that I envision that a state should have is that if you can means test someone and work out that they're not desperate, then that they have alternative choices. I mean, it maybe sounds like backwards logic. Because shouldn't desperate people who choose to do something in order to obtain money, yeah, I mean, it's be allowed to then act on that desperation as they so conscientiously choose. It's I mean, this is what makes the whole industry morally repugnant. And even trying to just kind of selectively tailor to reduce that moral repugnancy is is a kind of trying to use the state to morally enforce things. But again, I know that it sounds very highfalutin for me to say, okay, well, only if you are means tested and it is actually proven that you don't need to be a prostitute in order, um, then you can be a prostitute. You can be a prostitute if you don't need to be a prostitute. If you're not doing it out of necessity, you can be a prostitute. If that is the test of the law, or the structure of the law, in order to obtain a license, that then it would be a kind of licensed industry. The value in that is that then the idea would be that people that were actually desperate would not have to fall into prostitution, that there would actually be alternative assistance for them, that their desperation would be ameliorated by other functions that the state had, or that people, charity, that there would be charities. And I think that might actually, I mean, I know that what I've just said sounds like like an aristocrat's sort of view of morality, and it's very top down or something like that. But it does actually, it does. I mean, patting myself on the back, it does actually pan out. I think. I mean, this does actually lead to a kind of functioning thing. Um, I've heard. I don't like to associate myself with these types of people, but there is a kind of intelligent. I've heard people who are ultra right wing, who are basically even a bit fascistic, that they believe in kind of ultimate state power and things like that. And and they sometimes they make very astute arguments around some issues, like uh, the argument that I'm thinking about was made by a YouTube channel that doesn't exist anymore called The Absolute State. And in their YouTube channel, in this one YouTube video, they spoke about how middle class people can use drugs and it's not a problem. It doesn't destroy their lives. But poor people that use drugs end up, sort of becoming destitute and very desperate. And it destroys their families more so. That, I mean, obviously drugs also destroy the lives of middle class people and even very rich people. Addiction is a really pernicious scourge. And just the physical effects of taking narcotics and drugs. These are very dangerous things to everyone in society, but it does have a disproportionate effect on people who are poorer, and there are some middle class people who can have dalliances that can use this on a semi-habitual basis, and they get away with it. They kind of get away with it. Now, I would say that they probably don't get away with it perfectly. They're living a kind of suboptimal life to some degree, but essentially, it's not a problem that needs any kind of political redress. Maybe it could, if you feel strongly about it, then go preach about it, go make moral arguments to people, or something like that. But essentially, some people can get away with it, and so this is, I think, exactly how the prostitution thing is exactly the same kind of thing. That this is generally speaking, it's not a good thing for society as a whole. But that doesn't mean that we have to treat society like an on or off switch, like it's all or nothing. Like you can't, you don't have to treat a topic like it's just one topic, like it's just one thing. Nothing is just one thing. So if we can actually subdivide the issue and sub-select what is permissible and what is impermissible, then we have a much more sophisticated law that is actually morally transparent, as it were, in its rationale. It actually makes sense within its rationale. Now, that kind of more sophisticated form of governance and sophisticated form of moral and political issue and of the content of the law itself. Imagine having a means test to if you could be a prostitute or not. I mean, it's just, it sounds, there is also how to scale that with the rule of law to some degree. Well, I mean, you could say, well, a means test is an objective criteria that is applied across the board. Now, obviously, I mean, I'm talking slightly off the cuff and I'm talking slightly roughly, but those are just ways of talking about these things. Okay, now, it might not be a means test. It would be something like a kind of a desperation test, essentially, like, to work out how are you doing this because you are being coerced into this profession, essentially. And which is also problematic because people can end up precipitating conditions that, so this would be, well, if you want to be a prostitute, you actually have to keep your options open. Otherwise, we're going to close off this. You have to have other streams of income, essentially. You can't just be a prostitute. If you want to be a prostitute, you also essentially have to be an entrepreneur or a small business owner, or you have to have other streams of income, essentially, in order to be a prostitute. You can't be solely reliant on prostitution, essentially. You have to do some other kind of part-time work that, gives you experience that if you wanted to, you could scale into that profession or something like that. I think that is actually a kind of workable solution. Anyway, that's just showing, I think, the kind of So if you did want to crack down on prostitution, so as I said, in a liberal society, generally everything should be free to do. But if you want to regulate it, you have to regulate it by translating your soft moral sentiment into the hard power of the state. And the only way that you would be able to crack down on prostitution is implementing something like the structure that I just gave forth, which ends up making the law much more morally self-consistent, much more principled, but also purposeful in that it actually has a vision, and its vision actually, there's a moral transparency in such a structure. And as I've described, this is a kind of technocratic translation of moral sentiments, but those moral sentiments have to be translated into the moral anarchism of the state. That's why I call it moral anarchism, because, I can say for myself that I think that prostitution is wrong, is problematic. There's something fundamentally debilitating about it in terms of it's kind of like I'm actually going to get into this issue where I talk about hope and the necessity of having a kind of good hope and not having a hope substitute or a crutch, which sort of stops you from actually leading towards a forthright, purpose-driven self-determinism and confronting things and increasing your responsibility. Anyway, so I'm going to talk now about bootstrapping or growing and developing an internal locus of control, because I was having a conversation with someone about the internal locus of control, and he forced me to kind of ground these things from the ground up and to talk about how you would go about developing this. And actually, he wasn't asking me about the internal locus of control. He was asking me about principles, because I talk a lot about principles and normative values. And he said, he's like, where do they come from? What are the ones that I should have, or something like that? And I think that you have to think about it yourself. You have to develop them yourself, and you have to get in tune with your own intellect. You have to be honest about your own disposition on things, about your own feelings about things, and then you have to be able to judge your own feelings. You have to be able to hate your own sentiments so that you're capable of modulating them, as it were. And this has to do with the via negativa and hate, which is also something that I've spoken a lot about as a necessity for grounding your internal locus of control in a kind of honesty, in a kind of now this is a complicated topic, so this is probably going to be slightly ineloquent, but hopefully I'll cover all the aspects of it. So the reason, and this is predominantly comes from the Christian, how it's expressed in Christianity, is that Jesus has this very tough for some teaching, and it's hard to understand it. It says, if you don't hate your mother and your father and your brother and your sister and even your own life, you are not worthy to be a disciple of me. So just to be worthy to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, you have to be able to hate all these things. Now, this kind of hate is a kind of intellectual hate, but it's also a hate that finds its own genuine content. Because you can't just hate yourself without a purpose behind it, without a good hope. Good hope must animate the hate. Otherwise, it's not even real hate. It's just a label. You're just mimicking a picture of hate that you were told that this is what hate looks like in the world. And so then you say, okay, I'm going to hate myself. I'm going to be angry with myself. But what are you angry for? If the hate does not even have a way to exert itself in a way that is, then it's not even hate. It's just, you're just labeling the condition that you're in as being one of a hatefulness, but it's a hollow hate. It's not even real. For it to be real, it would have to be actionable. It would have to be manifestable in some form. So otherwise, you've got also meaningless hate. Like, otherwise, your hate that you're supposedly cultivating or indulging in is literally meaningless. And you could try hating yourself for indulging in meaningless hate, so that you cut that out. That's the via negativa that generates real understanding. So hate without hope attached to it, a hope, a purpose attached to it, is not even a real thing. It's just a label. It's just a semantic label that you are narrating yourself as being camouflaged by that condition. You've just painted yourself as that. You've just decided to say, well, I am now hating myself. But what are you hating yourself for, you see? So this all comes to discovering the internal locus of control, okay? So now, if you discover the internal locus of control, I think the internal locus of control is the first principle. It is the mother principle. It is the holistic principle. Your principled footprint is your internal locus of control. Now, after you have an internal locus of control, which requires making your internal locus distinct from the external locus. So you just work out the boundary between, this is, in Qigong, Taoist healing, this is the main function, is just knowing the boundary between where you end and something else begins. Okay, so so I think that you have to evaluate and monitor and watch your internal locus of control within your own conceptualization of yourself. And I do think that conceptualization of your own internal locus, so that you can watch it and that you can look at its condition, look at its characteristics, look at what it contains and what it's doing, look at its habits. When you look at these things, you realize that it's I think that this entity that I'm talking about, this conceptualization of this is having a spiritual awareness of your own contents. This is naming your own spirit and discerning your own spirit. But you can also use this to discern the spirits of others, which might not be that useful, but also what you can judge in others, you can bring home to use as inspiration for refining. Because if you can find faults in others, perhaps you can run that metric on yourself. You can run, oh, am I prone to this error? Am I prone to this subordination of some principality of the air? Am I following some camouflaged, sort of environmental conditioning that I'm falling under the auspices thereof? So you've got this view of your own internal locus of control. And I do think that you have to be able to hate your own locus of control in order to revise it, in order to change it. So if you're not capable of hating your own life in that way and judging your own life in that way, then you're not going to be honest about even having the transparency needed in order to grow and develop and quicken and be a quickening spirit. And so this means that you have the capability to make mistakes. And if you have the capability to make mistakes within your own mind, you have the capability of changing, of alteration, of growth and development. So being able to monitor your own errors, as it were. Now, being able to frame yourself in this way is I also think that this might not be exactly what the Greeks were talking about when they were talking about the daemon, the messenger of your soul. But I think that this might be somewhat connected to the daemon, which also has anyway. There's a recent His Dark Materials is a series that kind of maybe has some aspects of this as a kind of fantasy metaphor. But anyway, but seeing the representation of the influence that you can have in terms of how you view the world, as it were. But sorry, that's a bit of a tangent. But anyway, the reason why I brought up the Greek daemon thing is because the daemon was seen as the messenger between the gods and yourself and the soul and the fate of your life in some sense, and you could almost send it out, and it would bring you insight, and it would bring you intuition, it would perhaps bring you wisdom, communicating with it in some sense. But I would just say that perhaps that is a way of viewing the conceptualization of your internal locus of control. Which is essentially your spiritual messenger. It is your spiritual identity or character. But it's not just because you have such an entity doesn't mean that it's not capable of reforming itself or rehabilitating or growing or changing anyway. Now, just because you have an internal locus of control, that's I think a necessary condition to having some kind of fulfilling life, but not necessarily. I think you also need self-consistency within it, which means that you have to solve some problems, like how unconscious you are, how on autopilot you are, how addicted you are to certain processes or habits. And you can also change a lot of these things, not by trying to say, well, I want a different identity. I want to look like I'm doing things differently. You could have a vision as to where you want to end up, and then you could just make incremental gradient you could just change your course by a few degrees, and in the long term incrementally land up where you're going towards. And also on the way there, incrementally you can also accelerate. You can learn how to do this faster as you monitor yourself for how I mean, one of the greatest things that dissipates people's self-efficacy, in terms of disrupting or having a fragmented self-consistency, is that I've just lost my own thread. What is it? The lack of a of the courage of confrontation and acting in accordance with a hope. So, nihilism is really the problem here. And rehabilitating your courage to hope and being mindful of having a hope that is a sustainable hope, that, Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this. I'm perhaps talking about it more explicitly, but essentially the need to have a good hope that is capable of conserving itself, but that is also capable of knowing how it has disrupted itself in the past, that you had hoped to mentally make decisions in your own thought processes to set up habits and patterns. All your habits and patterns were at some point a conscious, inculcated activity that was directed by your mind. Now your mind is a slave to habits, or a slave to it's gone on autopilot in some things. And so regaining the levers of that kind of conscientious leverage because maybe you have completely denigrated even the concept of responsibility. By the way, what I'm talking about is spoken about a lot in Scientology philosophy. This is everything that Scientology is about rehabilitating responsibility and self-determinism. And they specifically talk about, I mean, that's what all their auditing and things like that have to do with. It's all about this stuff. It's about gaining control over the levers, and not being essentially caught by the trap that you've set up for yourself in terms of thinking that responsibility is now a pipe dream because you were so addled and burdened by your own disjointed and self-contradictory, sort of dispirited set of compromised purposes and failed hopes. And so you have diluted your hope, and you need to kind of aggregate it back into an internal locus of control. And that internal locus of control can't really do anything until it kind of constitutes a self-consistency, which does require understanding these mechanisms of dilution that you have undergone, as it were. So now, a good hope, that can be a good hope to have, the good hope of achieving self-consistency, so that you're not testing your internal locus of control, your holistic principle, that you act by principle and you act by your own principle, but those principles are having, so your internal locus of control is causing your life, is determining your life. It's not just a part of your life. It is, and that also requires a kind of bootstrapped epistemological pluralism. That you take ownership of how you epistemologically frame things, and that you center them around your own agency. Now, that is not to say that other things can't affect you, and that your agency might be particularly vulnerable or susceptible. But again, these are the kinds of mechanisms that we have to disabuse ourselves of. And in some sense also, it's very comforting to have excuses. It's very comforting to have, an external locus of control, to locate yourself in an external narrative, because then you never have to, and this also, you can have a priority list. I mean, there can be some things in your life that are very disruptive and that even prevent you from having a healthy progression of developing your own contemplative, sort of self-cohesion. And perhaps there are things that on a priority list of things that are disrupting you, but then there might be a separate list of things that you can actually do something about. And so you might not be able to tackle the first thing on the thing that's hurting you in being able to accelerate and pick up steam. But in some sense, if you don't hold yourself accountable, if you don't blame yourself essentially for these things, for the state of your own internal locus of control, then you don't have the power to manage it and to cultivate it, or to iteratively develop it by increment. So, people give up their power essentially to some external narrative and an external authority or external locus of control, which becomes a self-fueling thing. And, you can see that many people make excuses like this, and they have lots of, and because if you are going through something bad, that you have an excuse for why you're going through it, then you can also give yourself a consolation prize, which is, I think, generally what addiction is. Addiction has this kind of correlate with and parallel to nursing a kind of a substitute for having a good hope. And so you're kind of remembering your hope by engaging in the addictive soothing, because the procedure, the mechanism, the behavior itself is, I think, in some sense, drawing in the pain, the hurt, the trauma. It is remembering the, I mean, it's a horrible kind of, sort of, it's almost a kind of trifecta. And you can kind of get into a fractal within within a trifecta. And I can't remember the technical thing that I used to think about trifectas. It was, I don't. It's going to be too distracting for me to get into explaining what I mean about invoking trifectas. But I do think I must think about that and make a video about trifectas, because that is actually, it is a general. This is a general case of how self-determinism can essentially can concede itself. Is I think the structure of that is essentially a trifecta. It's almost like sort of creating a self-fueling logical fallacy that ends up kind of paradoxically. There might also be a kind of trifecta between the three sides of the mind as well. But yeah, it's I don't know how I'm going to describe it, but essentially the problem with trifectas is that you end up sort of creating two dilemmas. And so because you've got like four outputs, you can try to balance them, and so you're constantly sort of tending towards them. When I say, because there are two possibilities in each dilemma, and because you're dealing with two dilemmas simultaneously, that leads to a third dilemma of a kind of meta dilemma, which, because it's sourced from two dilemmas that essentially are a group of four outputs, you're choosing the meta dilemma is a kind of nebulous and ambiguous one, which could collapse. The meta dilemma has an alternative to it. So the meta dilemma is either one dilemma or it's another dilemma. So it's actually sort of four dilemmas, but two of the dilemmas are primary, and then two of the dilemmas are secondary substitutes, and or emergent. The two dilemmas that come afterwards, in some sense, is only one, but it can be substituted, and so you can. So, like, I do think that sort of addictions have two modes, sort of, and that would be the substitute of those two dilemmas. And so you can pick which dilemma to sort of be gnashing your teeth about. But the whole thing is structured, essentially. I mean, this is all a kind of mirror trick of putting two mirrors parallel to one another, so you can see like an infinite row of mirrors because of the slight, angle that you might see when you are looking at the edge of the mirror in the mirror trick. Within one of the mirrors looking at the reflection of the other mirror, or at least the edge of the other mirror. But that this is just essentially an endless abyss for your hope to be absorbed by. Anyway, that is a technical thing that is going to require a special treatment of it, and I'll have to think about it, about how to present it and lay it out in a much more coherent way. But I mean, maybe even the mirrors is a perfect analogy, because you can choose which mirror to look at, and it's the same infinite regress in some sense. Anyway, anyway, so the primary principle is internal locus of control, but then that can still be prone to nihilism, and usually I think that nihilism is from something like a trifecta, something like addiction, which means that essentially your good hope has been diluted, and so you need to collect your good hope, and you need to even in the Hindu scripture they talk about the introspective sage at night time is in Hinduism as well. In the Gita it talks about the many branched intelligence that needs to become, it's cracked, it's branched into fragmentation, needs to be integrated. And the second principle is essentially establishing a good hope, so that you can even do things like have judgments and evaluations and emotions, emotions are always reflections of beliefs and thinking. There is no emotion that does not equate to a belief. So if you have emotion, you have a belief, and you need to be able to diagnose those beliefs reflexively. You need to be able to say, oh, I have these emotions. These are the beliefs that are generating those emotions. Are these beliefs self-consistent? Are they disparated? How I need to work out more sophisticated principles to work out how these judgments can lead into a holistic treatment and an actualization, so that I can actually be purposeful with my emotions, that my emotions aren't just dysregulated and labile. And yes, you can have many emotions simultaneously, and you also have to work out, what is your priority going to be? Which emotions are you going to deal with first? And maybe it's not the strongest ones that need to be tended to, because maybe the undergirding issues that relate to those have a certain relationship to one another. That there's a pragmatic flow chart, and if you don't have the patience to be able to feel all these feelings and be able to hate that you're feeling all these feelings intellectually, disregard them as being, well, the thing that I am, my character that is emulating these emotions, is something that I should scorn and have hate for, because it's for being stupid. I do think that because stupidity means that you don't even have the authentic feeling. You've just labeled yourself as within your own narrative framework, which means that essentially you're painting yourself in the mimicry of the world. You're painting yourself, because I was told that this is what hate looks like, and now I'm telling myself that I'm hating my own contents of my own thinking, or the contents of my own emotion. But do I actually hate my own thinking? Because if I hated it, that means that I would have to have some alternative, some substitute for doing something else, that I should be doing this rather than that. You have to hate yourself for a reason. And so, in a sense, the hate that Jesus is talking about is the development towards generating the ability to move the internal locus of control. The internal locus of control is like the feet, is like the faith, the grounding. But faith without action, without change or movement, without actualization, is meaningless. So if you're just grounded, you need to move, and the thing that moves the feet are the legs, and the self-consistency are the legs. And so without the self-consistency, self-consistency means essentially discovering this good hope, which is the original hope that you had that was diluted. So that's all the important stuff. So the first principle really is the internal locus of control and working out the boundary between you and the external and bootstrapping that. And then the second thing is self-consistency. And again, like even as you're developing self-consistency, these are not sufficient conditions for not being nihilistic, but they are, I mean, if you have that kind of ability to control your own thinking in this way, I mean, there is no reason not to help yourself and be your own friend and to help to cultivate yourself. Happiness is helping people. How can you and if you don't have the self-respect to help yourself, you can hate yourself for not having the self-respect to help yourself. You can have that as something that you want to change. So I do think that you can derive all these things from the ability to intellectually hate your own life, so that you can have the intellectual clarity to have the capacity. If you don't have this capacity, you don't have the capacity to be honest enough and serious enough and committed enough to managing this internal locus of control, which really has to be the first commitment and the first priority. The spiritual body must be the first priority. And this is a contemplative thing. This doesn't mean that, oh, you do this, you can say whatever you want to whoever you want. This is all within you. This has nothing necessarily, this does not necessarily have to lead to changing your behavior in any way. It doesn't necessarily, I mean, it's up to you. You have the freedom to then choose to do that. This gives you the control to choose to be, sort of nice to yourself, as it were. So it gives you the choice, and it gives you the freedom, and it gives you the power and the capability. Okay, anyway, this recording has gone on long enough, but was there any other issue? I wanted to talk about grounding, the internal locus of control, and this is really, this is really all to do with normative values and principles, because then you are capable of thinking through principles in your mind, and it actually has an immediate effect on your being. So you do some thinking about things. You because really what it is principles are like rules that you are imposing on your own conceptualization of things. So it's kind of like a context of validity. So you have a kind of way of contemplating about morality, contemplating about your own ethics. I mean, look, principles kind of have two aspects to them. There's, first of all, choosing your principles and evaluating principles that you want to have, and then the other one you could say is living up to them, or actually performing them or acting in accordance with them. And in some sense, all of these things that are principles, I would philosophically frame them as being like what Aristotle was calling, sort of our recollected wisdom, or the recollection view of knowledge. This is the only true knowledge. This is the only true spiritual knowledge, is of these kinds of principles. And when you are thinking about them and discovering them, you are remembering them. You are resonating with them because they already are part of your being. They're part of your character. They are characteristics of your internal locus of control that then you are resonating with or identifying with. Okay, so Um, Now, obviously then at some point, maybe if someone says, oh, you're being inconsistent, or, you're not being transparent, or, you're not communicating well enough about this or something like that, and you're actually got inconsistencies, it doesn't mean that you won't make mistakes. It doesn't mean that you're going to be infallible, but it means that you'll be capable of taking feedback on and revising and refining things. So this is a quickening thing. It leads to refinement. Okay, but what is my point here? Okay, so the principles themselves then are seen as original to your internal locus of control, as being native and natural to them. It's the same essential quality. This is also sorry, I mean, I haven't linked this to the Christian doctrine so much, but this is what the only begotten Son means. The internal locus of control, the only begotten Son, that is the condition, the true condition of your mind that has to be self-discovered, or the original good hope that developed your intellect, that grew your personality, as it were, but then fell into fumbling and falling into its own sort of trifecta, as it were, but and then losing track of its own thread of responsibility, and self-determinism, and denigrating its own internal locus of control. Anyway, but okay, so how you think about principles then is, you just think about issues, and you think about creating general rules out of those issues. You think, okay, well, let me think of the general rule about how I should think, and these rules are for that they control your thoughts. They don't control your thoughts because they must control your thoughts. They control your thoughts because that isn't. You will see that is naturally how thinking only works. It facilitates a greater reach, a greater span of consideration, a greater scope of contemplation. It opens up vision of things. And sometimes your vision expands, but it expands in a substandard way or in a shoddy way, and then it needs to be refined. So it's kind of like a growing terrain, okay, a growing map of your own epistemological agency. It's a capacity of your own agency. So, an epistemic agent is also then capable of making true statements within their own framework that are self-consistent, and they're capable of being heard. And then they're not part of the world, and therefore they're not dealing in some commodity of external authority. They are speaking from their own authority, from their own understanding. Okay, so the principles. Sorry, I keep on going back to this because I'm not finishing the point that I want to make about. So, the way to try out principles is you try to create rules for how to think about things, the limits of your own contemplative structure, and sometimes some rules, they're like contexts, like they're like instruments or tools. Like you can start thinking about this thing, you can start thinking about another thing that is a completely different type of issue. So these rules are not going to be blanketly applied to all domains. There are going to be specializations. Some are going to be more general than others. It's going to be like an umbrella, and the core of that umbrella, the root of that umbrella, is the internal locus of control. So within the internal locus of control, you can set up different contexts, and you need to have those contexts not compete with one another, or if they do compete with one another, you need to have a merged context that systematizes and harmonizes with all these things. So you need rules in each ambit in order to have a kind of the chorus. And this is what people get when they are listening to good sermons and good preachers and good evangelists. When they are getting good teaching, good spiritual teaching does this for people. It solves these problems. It gives them scaffolding to remember, to recollect, to resonate with, but also to order their internal structure. This is what moral teaching does. And so, and this is all under the second primary thing, which is self-consistency. So the primary principle is internal locus of control. And then kind of secondarily, but almost very similarly, is self-consistency. And so you actually have to care about self-consistency. You have to be serious about it, about building it. And that requires thinking about principles and evaluating these things for yourself. And yes, you will make mistakes and you can make refinements. And, that is how, that is the point of communicating, and that is also how we are capable of not being alone in this world, because we share principles with other people and we can resonate with that actualization of principle, or that expression of principle. We can then know that we're in the same group, we're in the same society, or we're in the same organization that has a shared ethos, or that is how relationships are contextualized, is by the sharing of certain principles. Everything is grounded according to this. And so making these things open to negotiation or open to explicit discourse can also strengthen and also radically allow us to quickly develop things where other people are limited by doing these things unconsciously, or doing them in the background, or doing them inadvertently, or doing them. I mean, look, there is some ways about there are lots of layers of communication. These things can be done. Also, you can negotiate these things directly. And the tactfulness, the artfulness, the level of principle to which, sometimes you can't do this with people who don't share us. The more principles you already share with someone, probably or at least the more core principles you share with someone, the easier it is to actually. That's why the identity politics people are so dangerous, because they, in some sense, share a lack of principles, and in some sense they have a substitute for those principles, which is essentially just kind of scapegoating. And that's the only thing that brings them together, really, is scapegoating the same target, because they have no principle of concordance. They have no principle of concordance. So instead they have, literally, it's like a wolf tribe, and they are hungry for the scent of blood. Obviously, I'm referring to the Dostoevsky poetry and such of the wolf tribe. But anyway, okay, this has been a long enough recording, but I think I've had a good moral lecture now, sort of talking about all these issues in conjunction.